Thank you, everyone. And we have someone monitoring the chat today. So if you have a question, feel free to put it up in the chat area, and I'll try and address those at the end. Just to remind everyone, it is being recorded, so feel quite okay to turn your video off if that's something you'd like to do, and keep muted, so keep the extraneous noise down. Now, this is the second time I've given this presentation, so hopefully it's even better than the first time. And I want you to have a look at the URL that's written on the first slide. So if you would like a copy of this presentation, not a video recording, the actual slides, that URL will take you there. And you can even do that right now if you're sitting in front of your computer at home. You can type that in. So tinyurl.com/Machen 2021 V2, second time I've given this talk. One of the things that is important today is to recognise that Jerry Tien, one of our fantastic researchers in psychological science, passed away at the end of last year. So I really wanted to dedicate this talk to his memory, and hopefully it'll be the beginning of a series of talks, perhaps each year, where we talk about important issues in psychological science. So Jerry, we miss you. What I'll talk about today is listed up on the slides there, and I'll also give you some of my background in a minute as well. So this is an overview of the talk, but then I'll give you a bit of an overview about me as well. So what are issues that concern the work readiness of psychology graduates, psychological science in undergraduate training, undergraduate psychology training, obviously, changes to the psychology training model from 2022. This is quite a big issue for anyone who's thinking about psychology as a professional career. Something called a Job Ready Graduates Package, which has introduced some complexity into some of the decisions you might make and making career decisions in light of the above. There are very compelling reasons to consider what you can do with a psychology degree. I believe that all students want to be able to achieve their career goals and have a satisfying career. However, it isn't always the case that we know exactly what we would enjoy and be good at from the very beginning. And I was one of those students as well. So it can be more like a voyage of discovery rather than perhaps following our dream. I did not have a clear career goal, but I feel like I took advantage of opportunities as they came along. And I think that's a pretty key element of doing well in our careers. I did start off studying engineering at University of Queensland, and a year of that was enough to confirm I was not meant to be an engineer. I did complete honours in psychology at University of Queensland in 1984 with my, sad to say, 2B honours, and applied for a postgraduate program in applied psychology at UQ. But unfortunately, the feedback that I received was that it was too soon for me to go on to postgraduate training. Being good at statistics, however, I enrolled in a research master's degree, started tutoring undergraduate students, which is so much fun, of course, and then looked at professional opportunities that as they came up, and I'll talk more about them in a second. I certainly have had this growing interest in applied research, and that was confirmed as I went through my research master's degree. However, what can possibly happen when you're doing a research program that might interfere? Well, for us, it was my supervisor left the university. I started a psychology business. I actually started a church and a charity here in Ipswich. I got married to Tanya, who's sitting here. We had 2 of our 3 children, a son and a daughter. So research just doesn't happen easily in that kind of context. I then started working full-time for the Commonwealth Government Department of Employment, Education and Training as a psychologist, and very thankful for the opportunity I got to do interesting research projects actually into ways to help minimise the negative impact of unemployment. Some of those research projects turned into subsequent PhDs later on. I completed a Master of Arts, which is actually a research-only master's degree, another undergraduate degree, and while I was ready for a break from studying, that did not happen. I got a phone call from my mentor, Jerry Fogarty, who wanted me to teach here for one semester in 1992. So I started here on the 17th of February at USQ in 1992, just on a 6-month contract, and then stayed all the way through until the end of 2020. I was fortunate to have a great supervisor in Jerry Fogarty, and that makes all the difference in a PhD project. So that was completed eventually in 99, and then other things followed. I won't talk too much actually about all of the things that happened while I was here at USQ, except I do want to make this clear point that I've seen myself as a psychological scientist and organizational researcher for quite a long time. I am fully registered and have endorsement, but that is actually secondary to me. And also I want to make the point that everything that I ever undertook in terms of a project, I could have undertaken without being a registered psychologist, because the skills, knowledge, and expertise was there from my training as a psychological scientist, right? So that's one of my key points today. The question about what you can do with a psychology degree has been asked many times, and maybe some of you are thinking right now, is this the right degree? What am I going to do? Where will I end up? And these are important questions. Back in 2018, Eric Landrum made the point that this is actually a complicated question to answer, and it does need some unpacking. And I've got a reference I can give you for Eric's article. It does help to remember that psychology is both, it's a discipline as well as a profession. So not everyone who studies psychology becomes a psychologist. Okay, so the discipline of psychology underpins and is what sustains psychology as a profession. And in fact, the health of the profession relies on the health of the discipline of psychology. So I will describe several factors that are going on, major changes in things like the training model for the psychology profession. The psychology training pathways are changing. So that's quite important that everyone understands what that will mean. The key takeaway message today, though, is that if you focus on building your psychological literacy, this enhances your career options. So that's the key focus of the message. People often have wondered, employers perhaps being the key party, whether psychology graduates are work ready. So this is a really important question because people assume that a degree title or a major should translate into a specific job in a field, okay? And that assumption is what causes so many difficulties. A major in psychology does not enable one to become a psychologist, not at that point. So therefore, the degree title or the major doesn't necessarily always result in working in a job field with that word psychologist in the title. The number of undergraduate students enrolled in the psychology major in all its various forms is quite large and exceeds the number of students who are able to enroll in postgraduate psychology programs. So back in 2019, our graduate outcomes survey told us that about 9,424 students graduated with a psychology undergraduate degree in Australia, about 3.1% of the total number of graduates. Psychology was one of the study areas with the lowest rate of full-time employment in 2019. So people who graduated prior, one of the lowest rates of full-time employment, around 63.4%, but had a high proportion of undergraduates proceeding to full-time study that year, about 35%. So you put those two numbers together, it's very close to 100. So clearly a lot of undergraduate psychology students proceeded on to do further study. Now that makes sense. Honours or the equivalent would have been what many were doing. But obviously there's a large proportion who were not doing study that year as well. In 2020, the same survey from Graduate Outcomes Survey found the percentages were about 61.4% of full-time employment and about 32% in full-time study. So together, the bulk of students are in employment or in study, but it doesn't necessarily mean the employment is suitable or exactly the type of employment that people were interested in. Okay, there's some other data which I can cite, but I just won't belabor the point there that we really have no idea on what are the pathways that undergraduate students may take, which involves further study in different discipline areas like education, business, or HR, or who may even choose not to do anything in psychology after completing an undergraduate degree. So that's something we cannot actually comment about because we don't have the data. What we do need, though, is a different focus when preparing students for the workforce of the future. And this focus, you probably have heard this word employability and employable skills a little bit now if you're enrolled in a psychology program. So the workforce of the future will involve employability skills, cultural and ethical perspectives, self-management skills, amongst other things. And we do need a more nuanced or a philosophy or an approach that suits each context when it comes to employability. So in fact, one set of authors have said, what we actually need is to look at employability issues for different types of occupations, different modes of employment, different life and career stages, and different cultural contexts. So there's not just one model or one way of always talking or looking at these things. Other authors I've mentioned there argue that we need this very clear understanding of the discipline-specific attributes of psychology graduates. Now, I'll talk a little bit more about what these are likely to be. And a better way of capturing these discipline-specific attributes is really under this construct or heading called psychological literacy. So, what is a psychology major really about? Well, I think it's a developmental process. Which is nearly always a good idea to think about things in a developmental process. Where undertaking a psychology major or degree incorporates progressively greater levels of psychological literacy, self-regulation, and professionalism. So you should be able to identify how these things are changing during the time you're involved in a psychology undergraduate degree. Your core identity needs to be evolving into that one where you understand you are a psychological scientist, but you may be able to then decide to practice in clinical settings, to do research, to teach, or even go into government policy area, which is really quite important. So I've got a nice graphic I'll show you at the end where I think it sort of captures this idea that what starts as a seedling will grow into a sapling, into a mature or senior tree, but eventually it falls and dies. And there's a whole story around what that may look like as well. Maybe that's when you become most productive or most influential. So I'm going to talk a little bit now about psychological science and particularly how we develop this understanding of the application of psychology progressively through a degree. Myself and Natalie Gasson have just completed a chapter where we talk about psychological literacy is really critically important in psychology training pathways. Our accrediting body, which is called the Australian Psychology Accreditation Council, has said the purpose of an undergraduate degree is to provide students with this broad and coherent knowledge and skills in the scientific discipline of psychology. So this is the standard that universities and other providers outside of universities are meant to aim for with the undergraduate psych degree. Now, obviously, that is extended, that is broadened to include things like cultural competencies, critical thinking skills, and understanding of ethics in the research and the professional context. Students also are developing communication and research skills that enable the application of this discipline knowledge. And these are really quite critical. The combination of knowledge and skills that you develop is known as psychological literacy. And psychological literacy is a concept that, as you reflect on it, will help you develop a clearer understanding of the outcomes of your first degree and how it will impact on your employability skills, what preparation it provides you with for future work. Now, I've got a bit of an advert here. So this is just to let people know that while we talk about things, we often need to also be able to assess them in order to have an understanding of how they're changing. Okay, so this is pretty critical for us in our profession. So part of the research into psychological literacy involves assessing it and comparing it with employable skills, self-efficacy or confidence in Australian undergraduate psychology students. And the project that's happening right now at USQ is looking at how people rate options or responses for different scenarios that cover some of the research skills that you're developing in your undergraduate program. So I've got a link embedded in the presentation, and I will give you that link again at the very end. So tinyurl.com/TOPL-R for the test of psychological literacy revised. And I will come back to that just at the end. One of the reasons we're talking about this issue is that pathways to registration are changing, and the result of a long process of consultation, as a result of that process, the number of pathways will change in that the supervised practice pathway will no longer accept new provisional registrants from 30 June 2022, which is only 1 year away. So from 30 June 2022, there will no longer be this, what we used to call 4+2 or supervised practice pathway. You will need to apply for a postgraduate program, either a 5th year or a 5th and 6th year. Happy to talk more about that if anyone has any questions. So in fact, there may be more people looking for non-clinical career paths and satisfying careers in psychological science in the future, as obviously we are hoping that there will be no shortage of people who are studying psychology in the future. This dilemma, if you like, actually is made even more critical by the fact that last year the government introduced a package of changes in order to produce what they call job-ready graduates. And some of that involved dramatically changing the funding that's available to support students who are studying. I'll talk a little bit about this simply because it causes us in the profession, the psychology profession, and as psychology educators, quite a dilemma as to how to promote good career options when in fact the funding model is now biased towards one of those options. So there are 3 priorities in this Job Ready Graduates package, and I'll just read them out. Increasing innovative approaches to work integrated learning, increasing STEM skills graduates, and psychology firmly sits in that STEM area, and sometimes it's also called STEAM or STEM with another M, and improving outcomes for employment and supporting universities with developing collaborations with industry. Now, I don't argue with those things, those are quite worthy goals, but how they've done that is really the issue. Students commencing psychology studies from this year, from 2021 onwards, will need to follow a particular pathway called a psychology professional pathway. So at USQ from 2021, the situation is that commencing students in the psychology professional pathway make a student contribution per 8 units per full-time student load, if you like, of about $8,000, $7,950. But if you're in the clinical psychology postgraduate training pathway, it's $3,950. So the student contribution is meant to nudge, incentivize, or push people into professional psychology pathways. If you're studying psychology outside of the psychology professional pathway, which is specifically defined by the degree that you enroll in, then you can expect to make a contribution per 8 units per full-time student load in a year of about $14,500, which is quite dramatically different from the $7,950. If you're a continuing student, so you've commenced prior to 2021, the contributions are a little bit different, $6,804 per 8 units or FCEL for undergrad, and honours $3,950 for clinical psychology pathways. Now, it's important to realise that this is not the entire income that universities derive. There are other, the student contribution is only part of the income. But again, these numbers, the government has chosen these numbers to deliberately push people towards what they're calling the professional psychology pathway. And there's a similar thing applies actually for the counselling profession. So I'm not ignoring the counselling profession, I'm just focusing on psychology for the moment. So a strong signal is being sent to students that favours the professional psychology pathway at the same time that this pathway, due to a long process of consultation, is being modified to remove one of the options, the supervised practice option. So there's a strong incentive to focus on the practice of psychology, particularly in clinical settings, with very little recognition of the wide variety of settings for applying psychological knowledge and expertise. And that's something that we need to be very aware of right now. This is not an easy situation. So anyone who undertakes to study psychology, clearly you receive training in skills and knowledge that are important to employers. Thus, there are many career options that are available to students who are trained in psychology in the undergraduate and then later on in honours or further postgrad if they choose to do that. So one of the challenges that many students face is not this issue around what can I do, but how do I choose what to do? So one of the things that we're focusing on here at USQ is how to enhance career options in psychological science. And that's the next bit of the presentation, and it will lead me up towards the end of it as well. Anyone who undertakes to study psychology will at some point want to investigate what options are available. What other things can you do besides that, just that professional pathway, training to be a registered psychologist and then potentially have areas of practice endorsement in some area. So in order to help support students, there is a wonderful team of academics here at USQ and outside who are working on adapting the Canadian Handbook for Careers in Psychological Science. And that is a freely available handbook on the web. Maybe the URL is slightly hard to read. And that will be called the Australian Handbook for Careers in Psychological Science. So this Australian adaptation will support undergraduate psych students developing a broader view of different ways in which psychological science can be applied. So there's a quote there. Throughout this book, you will learn more about career search strategies, career opportunities related to psychology, and just some of the many ways that psychological science has been applied to opportunities and challenges facing our society. The outcome of that process, we hope, will be students linking content and learning outcomes from the courses in the undergraduate program to employable skills that are sought after in Australian workplaces and build your understanding and confidence in that process. There are already good career information and resource sites out there. So the Australian Psych Society has a section called Careers in Studying Psych. The American Psychological Association has a similar one around what you can use your bachelor's degree in psychology. To mention just a few, there's so many, it's actually impossible to list them all. What we would like to see though, is while there are many alternatives when considering your various career paths, that you actually start with this fundamental question of who you want to be. Describe the kinds of issues or problems that you want to be involved in addressing and what a difference you want to make. So that's my proposal to everyone. Start with this core idea as a psychological scientist, and then fill that in with the things that you would most like to focus on and how that would work. So I could help children with learning difficulties who struggle to keep up in the classroom, as an example. I could design tools to assist people to cope with major disruptions in their lives, such as natural disasters. I could work on making workplaces safer and reducing the impact of technological change. All of these are very valid ways of applying psychological science and are jobs that are going to be very relevant and important ones in the future. My favourite, of course, would be I could explore how people will survive a trip to Mars. I think that would be probably my next career if I had my choice. So just to wrap up then, there's a few comments that are important to make, because I don't want anyone to think that this is a simple process. And because of some of the challenges that you may have heard about, including something called the replication crisis, which reflects a whole lot of growing awareness of various poor research practices that have crept in over time, we may think that psychological science was actually doomed for a while, but in fact, Shrout and Rogers, after carefully reviewing the state of psychological science, they certainly agree that all psychologists, researchers must engage in methodologically sound, ethically driven research in which probabilistic decisions are made explicitly and respected by an open research process. It's a complicated sentence, but it's really meant to say we have to respect these key issues around our methodology and ethics, etc. But their prognosis is still that the future of psychological science is bright. And of course, the health of the psychology profession then can improve when psychological science is doing well. Many of us have gone through a very difficult time as a result of COVID-19 because of the disruption that it's caused in our world. It has been, in fact, the biggest threat that our world has had to face in recent times. People are researching the impact of COVID-19 on all kinds of areas, and the areas I'm interested in are things to do with the workplace. A very large number of researchers led by Kniffen provided a glimpse of the way in which the workplace is being impacted by working from home, which many of us have gotten used to, and for students that will clearly be studying from home as well as working from home. Virtual teamwork that has started to become common, virtual leadership and management, as well as the potential impact of the loss of important social connections, perhaps even increased uncertainty and the impact of unemployment. While these are some of the issues that we're facing, they can all be addressed with a careful application of psychological science. Science may produce enough effective vaccines eventually to allow us to do things like travel again and get back to something that's more normal, but psychological science is what protects us. That's the fundamental basis for all of the strategies to keep people safe. So we have to realize that it's the application of psychological science right now that is helping people to stay healthy and well. I have an enormous respect for Indigenous perspectives, and the APS apology summarizes it in this way. We as psychologists, and that's the psychology profession in total, have not always listened carefully enough to Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people. We have not always respected their skills, expertise, worldviews, and unique wisdom developed over thousands of years. So this is something that we have to understand, and the process that's happening, which is quite an interesting one, is called decolonizing and indigenizing the psychology curriculum. And that is underway here in Australia. So what can you do with a psychology degree? I've suggested become the best psychological scientist in your own practice, your teaching, your supervision, in leading through facilitation and program design. Managing teams, supporting volunteers, crafting interventions, analysing all types of data, and advising our elected leaders, because they truly do need our help. Our profession is facing this major challenge with a reduction in the range of career pathways open to graduates of a 4-year or a 4th-year program, at the same time as the focus is shifting to professional psychology pathways with strong financial incentives to follow those pathways. So the importance of a strong discipline base is clear, and there are many options open to psychology graduates with expertise in areas that employers greatly value and which our society desperately needs. I said at the beginning there was a link you could follow, and it's available on the screen. And the second link is the one to our current Test of Psych Literacy revised research project. This is our beautiful graphic which talks about starting out, seedling, sapling, mature tree, senior tree, and then eventually driftwood. I'm going to stop there. Is that a good point to pause the recording, do you think? Keep going? Okay, we'll let the recording go. and leave the screen, leave the presentation shared. Good. Very good. Let's see if I can just make this a little bit bigger. And happy to take any questions.